it's good that you got A4, because a lot of people don't really understand that criterion, first off, so it's good.
Got an A2.
And we've got A2 here, but not the A4, but maybe you didn't have enough time to go into it.
A2 as well.
A2.
So have the answers all together as well.
I'll just show you this graph here. This kind of attempts to explain the reasoning behind using A2 and A4. So we have information dating back to, okay, first of all, the generation length is about 100 years, so 3 generations is 300 years. And we have actual data from about 100 years ago. And over that time, from 100 years ago to now, there has been an 80 to 85% decline. So that's not 3 generations in the past. However, and we're looking at criterion A2 here, it's not 3 generations in the past, but when you think about the threats presented in the account, we've got things like habitat loss early on, and certainly habitat loss now will be contributing to declines because the species are already quite low in population size. But the main actual cause of decline is collecting. And that collecting seemed to kick in about the early 1900s when they were doing the photographic studies of the species. So this is probably mostly driven, habitat loss is contributing to it, but it's mostly driven by the actual collecting pressure. It's a very valuable species, it's very desirable, people want it. Prior to 100 years ago, it's probably safe to assume that the species wasn't in major decline because there wasn't extensive agriculture, there wasn't extensive habitat loss going on. I'm not sure if the account has actually really made that obvious, but I mean, thinking realistically, the collecting pressure started about this point. So although there might have been a slow decline because of general land use, it's unlikely that it would have been drastic enough to cause an even steeper decline over that 3 generation time period. So you can kind of assume that it was more or less stable prior to that time. So if you project back to about 300 years ago, then your decline rate would be from here down to here, which is about the same as, it's just the same rate of decline as over the last 100 years. So you could use critically endangered under A2 using that assumption, and you would document that in your assessment. In the rationale part of the assessment, you would document that. Clearly, for the example, we've taken out that kind of thing because we want you to work out. Okay.
I think we just thought that we don't have information.
Yeah.
We haven't.
Yeah.
But you're right. We can refer back.
Yeah. So you're assuming what's happened in the past.
In the user guidelines, there are several examples of what to do if you only have information for part of the time period, how you can backcast or recalculate for the correct generation time period, or what to do if you only have information for certain subpopulations, or information for different time periods for different subpopulations. There's a very long detailed section in the user guidelines. We just cut this. We made it as short as possible, I think.
Okay, and for the criterion A4, where you have, as you rightly say, you've got some real data over the last 1 generation. And the assessors have already, in the account, they're projecting 30 years into the future to say they're likely going to be another 30% decline between now and the next 30 years. So you can actually use that to add on to here and use criterion A4. Well, actual fact, no. If you use an A4, under your logic, you didn't project back to 3 generations ago, did you? You didn't use it to...
We only went back to 100 years ago.
Okay, so for criterion A4, you still need to use a 3 generation time period. So in your actual assessment there, you've only used from 100 years ago to 30 years in the future, haven't you? Is that right? Am I understanding right?
Yes, but I think that we were saying that, okay, if you have an 80 to 85% or 100, then you add additional
you're not expecting it to do that.
Are you expecting it when it says it's expected to continue to
So when you were going from 100 years in the past and you were
to 200 years in the future. Okay, the actual assessors of this, they have taken it from about this point here. So they've actually projected nearly 200 years in the past. Sorry, from this point here, no, this point here, down to 30 years in the future. So they did actually project back. And the reason they've done that is because they felt uncertain about what was going to happen in this period here in the future, because conservation measures have been implemented. Now it's debatable whether those conservation measures will have any effect, because one of the threats now is lack of pollinators as well. So is the species actually functionally extinct and it's just going to carry on the downward projection no matter what people do? We don't know, they don't know. So they were reluctant to project into the future in this case. But then they know the species really well, so that's a decision they made. Whereas you don't know the species, so you're having to look at the information here and make your judgment on that. So I mean, it's very reasonable that you made that judgment. But it kind of gives you an example as to what you can do when you actually know your species. You can make a slightly different decision, but document it in the assessment and say, this is why we didn't project. So that's the reason they didn't use criterion A3 as well. So they didn't want to take the assessment from now and then project 100 years into the future, because they really don't know what's going to happen beyond 30 years from now. Okay. Right. All right. We realize we've flown through.
So you can have, I don't know, just in this idea in my head, so you can have several criteria within each category.
Yeah.
You can have A1, A2, A4, there's several A's.
You can have A2, A3 and A4. You can have any combination of those. But if you're using A1, it has to be on its own, because by using A1 you're saying that the population has declined and the causes of decline have stopped, so that the population is starting to recover. So that's the only one you can choose a combination. Okay. Shall we go on to criterion B?
I just wanted to make one more comment. In this here, we said that it was listed under A2 and 4, A, C, and D. And other people have argued in other workshops, well, they've suggested that it should be under criteria, subcriterion B for the index of abundance, or they say just C and D, not A. When you're listing the species under criterion A, the really crucial bit is whether you used it under A2, A3, or A4. These additional subcriteria, A, B, C, D, and E, within criterion A, there are no thresholds related to those.
Yeah.
So whichever of those you choose, basically you choose the one that you use to base your assessment on. So some people have seen different elements that they base their assessment on, and we would generally accept any assessment as long as it's reasonable. And if we see, we think that you should use the P because that's obvious that there's an index of abundance, we would just contact the assessor and say, we think we should use this one, and say yes or no, this is why.
Yeah, we would never return an assessment of something under criterion A on the basis of, they've only said A to A and C, they haven't put B in, we'll refuse that. We would never do that. That's going into really fine detail. At least, if you've at least recorded all the information that you think, that you feel you've used to come to that conclusion, then that's fine by us, as long as it's obvious how you've got to that conclusion.
Criterion A, it's a bit unfortunate that criterion A is criterion A because we have to start with A. And that's actually a really complicated criterion. If we could start with B, it would make the whole process a lot easier because B is super straightforward. So this is going to be a really short presentation, which is fortunate because we're about to break for lunch. And the next, well, like I say, B is quite straightforward. So basically, criterion B has been designed to identify species that have a restricted geographic range and are also suffering severe fragmentation, continuing decline, or extreme fluctuations within that restricted range. So if you had a species like this that has a widespread distribution, this species isn't going to qualify for criterion B. We're really looking at species that have restricted distributions, and this is an extreme example of that. So criterion B, if you follow along on your summary sheet, this can also help, is based on either the estimated extent of occurrence and or the estimated area of occupancy. So just like under criterion A, you could list something under A2, A3, A4, or any combination thereof. You can list a species under B1, or under B2, or under both. It just depends which data you have, whether the species meets the thresholds for the extent of occurrence, or for the area of occupancy, or for both. And for a lot of species, we can estimate the extent of occurrence, but for many species, we don't have the detailed data that we need to estimate the area of occupancy. So there are more species listed under B1 than B2, but not always. Once you've met the thresholds for B1 or B2, or both, then you have to meet at least 2 of the subcriteria A, B, and C. So for A, the species can be severely fragmented, or it's found only in a very few number of locations. And remember the definition of location there. It's not localities, but the other location. B is a continuing decline at any number of different variables. That could be a continuing decline in the extent of occurrence, area of occupancy, the area, extent, or quality of habitat, the number of locations or subpopulations, or the number of mature individuals. And you would indicate whichever of those are undergoing a continuing decline, or extreme fluctuations in those same variables. So criterion B basically works like this. This just summarizes what you need to do. First, you would identify if you meet the thresholds for B1 and or B2. Once you've done that, then you would identify if there's severe fragmentation. You would count the number of locations. You would determine if there's a continuing decline and in what, and if there's extreme fluctuation and in what. And based on which of those subcriteria you met, then you would come up with your final assessment. So again, on the summary sheet, first you would have your thresholds. For critically endangered is from 10 to 100. Oh, sorry. For critically endangered, for the extent of occurrence, you have less than 100 kilometers squared, less than 5,000 for endangered, or less than 20,000 for vulnerable. And for area of occupancy, it's less than 10, less than 500, or less than 2,000 kilometers squared. If you've met any of those values for any of those categories, then you need to look at the following conditions and need at least 2. You can see what those are. So here's an example. We have a cactus species that lives on a mountain, on the foothills of a mountain, and its extent of occurrence has been estimated at 22 kilometers squared. Within that extent of occurrence, so if you follow along in your summary sheet, 22 kilometers squared is less than 100, so this species means critically endangered under B1. Its area of occupancy is 8 kilometers squared. That's less than 10, so it means critically endangered under B1 and B2. It's threatened by illegal collecting. There's a village nearby, and people come out and they collect the cactus. Because it's found in such a small area, they can cover the entire area. So all of the individuals in the species range are affected by that one threat from that one village of collectors. So there's only one location. So it still meets critically endangered under B1A and B2A. So now we just need to meet one more subcriteria in order to qualify for a listing under critically endangered. Because they're collecting individuals of this species, there's a continuing decline in the number of mature individuals. And because in this particular example, it's a large cactus, there's a continuing decline in the area of occupancy as well. As those number of mature individuals decrease, and because the area of occupancy is so small, then we can assume there's a continuing decline in the area of occupancy as well. So now we've met critically endangered B1A and B under 2, which is continuing decline in the area of occupancy, and 5, a continuing decline in the number of mature individuals. There are no extreme fluctuations in this species, neither in the population size nor in its distribution. So the final category, the final assessment is critically endangered B1, AB 2 and 5 plus 2 AB 2 and 5. And you'll notice that the subcriteria are identical for, I'm missing the point. The subcriteria are identical for both B1 and B2. Because of the way this particular criterion works, while for criterion A, for example, you could have different subcriteria, you couldn't possibly list a species under A3 because of direct observation, because you can't see into the future. So you can have differing subcriteria under A2, A3, A4, or A1. But for criterion B, the way it works, you can't have different subcriteria. You would always have the same subcriteria for B1 and for B2. One thing to keep in mind is that if you meet the thresholds for a high category of threat for some of the subcriteria, but not for all of the subcriteria, you have to list the species under the lowest common category of threat. So that looks like this. Let's say the species meets the extent of occurrence and area of occupancy thresholds for critically endangered, but it's found in, and there's a continuing decline, but it's found in more than one location. It's not severely fragmented, and there's no extreme fluctuations. You cannot use critically endangered because you don't meet the critically endangered threshold under A. If there was severe fragmentation, then you would have met the critically endangered threshold under A because there is no threshold. If it's severely fragmented, you automatically meet A, and then it would have been critically endangered A because of the severe fragmentation, and B because of the continued decline. But because we're looking at the number of locations, we have to look at the threshold values. And you always go for the lowest category. So although we met critically endangered for these thresholds, we don't meet those thresholds for the number of locations. So therefore the species will be listed as endangered B1 AB plus 2 AB. And that makes sense because although the species met the thresholds here, it has a less than 100 square kilometer extent of occurrence and a less than 10 square kilometer area of occupancy. These values are inclusive. So it's still, even though this is a larger number than 100, less than 100 square kilometers is still less than 5,000 square kilometers. So if a species is critically endangered, it automatically meets the thresholds for endangered and for vulnerable.
I'm just thinking about that. There might be a possibility that you would have a population that's less than got an ERO of less than 100, but it's in one large population compared to 5 smaller populations. And is that? Oh, it's not. It's location.
It's location. It's location.
That's why.
So you can have one location can impact several subpopulations.
Yes. Okay.
Or you can have, I'm starving, what's the reverse of that?
Yes.
Well, anyway, one location can encompass only one subpopulation or multiple subpopulations.
Yeah, that's why I was using locations and populations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Likewise, if you met, for example, so this species would be endangered.
And if it were found, let's say the extent of occurrence were 50 kilometers square, that meets the critically endangered threshold. But if it's found in 9 locations, the species would be listed under vulnerable if it met B or C. That make sense? Okay. Since it's 1 o'clock, I think we should break for lunch. We only have an hour for lunch. When we come back, we can do the criterion B exercise. Should be pretty straightforward. What I would like to do is show you your options for lunch. They're a bit limited, which is unfortunate. That's out of our control. These are the options near where we are. We would ask that you not go 15 minutes away walking because it's going to take a long time to get there and back. So in the hotel, there's a Korean restaurant, a Japanese restaurant, and I believe it's an Italian restaurant. They're fairly expensive, so if you can afford it, that's obviously the closest option and would be the best.